Listen up, you're about to see the most disturbing footage in Yosemite National Park history. The date is October 22nd, 1999, and Jan Davis is standing at the edge of El Capitan. That's right, the El Capitan, probably the most famous landmark in all of our national parks. 3,200 feet of sheer granite dropping straight down into Yosemite Valley. Now below Jan, 150 people are packed into the meadow looking straight up at her. They're screaming, they're chanting, there's reporters, tourists, protesters, as well as a line of park rangers who were pissed off with the spectacle that was taking place in their park. Back on the cliff, Jan was about to make the most consequential decision of her entire life, but she didn't know it yet. She wasn't scared. She had done this thousands of times before. She thought that this time would be no different than the last. And so she took a deep breath, and then the countdown began. 10,
9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. See ya!
I promise that you don't understand what you just watched, at least not yet, because that jump was only the beginning of this story, the story of the ugliest and possibly the deadliest controversy that Yosemite has ever seen. Now, to understand how we got here, to a Friday afternoon in 1999 where a 60-year-old woman leapt off of the most famous cliff in America wearing a prison jumpsuit, to understand how we got here, we need to back up. Have you ever heard of something called base jumping? The name is an acronym. It stands for buildings, antenna, spans, which is a fancy word for bridges, and earth, meaning cliffs. It's essentially skydiving, except instead of jumping from a plane at altitude, you're launching yourself off of a fixed object. It's one of the most dangerous extreme sports that exists, and the margins between a great jump and a disaster are razor thin. You literally only have a few seconds at most to pull the parachute. And honestly, that's why these jumpers love the sport so much. It's thrilling to do and thrilling to watch. And once you get the hang of it, it basically becomes muscle memory, almost as simple as just tapping a button. Oh, and speaking of tapping a button, if you are a repeat viewer, please tap that subscribe button. And if you're a new viewer, you can wait for now. I'm gonna do everything I can to earn your subscription by the end of this video. If you look at the numbers, you'll see that I am very close to 1 million subscribers. I'm really trying to hit it by the end of this year, and so I would appreciate any of your help. Now, hitting subscribe is a lot safer than base jumping is, because pretty much every jump invites the threat of something going terribly wrong. And now to understand why 60-year-old Jan, as well as 4 other daredevils, were willing to risk it all in Yosemite, you need to know about a different base jumper first. His name was Frank Gambale III. It was the early hours of June 9th, 1999, and Frank peered over the western edge of El Capitan, shivering in the pre-dawn chill. At 28 years old, Frank was already known as one of the best base jumpers alive, with over, this is crazy, 600 successful jumps. A pioneer who'd made the first ever jump from El Capitan's Salothe wall, and now he was planning to do it again. He belayed over the edge while hanging backwards, pulling stones from his pocket and dropping them to calculate fall rates against the wind. You see, Frank wasn't just a simple thrill seeker jumping off cliffs with no plan. He was a tactician, doing his due diligence as if his life depended on it, because, well, it literally did. Just before 5 a.m., Frank stood at the edge, and this time, well, he stepped off. No ropes, no wingsuit, just a simple parachute. Frank plunged 3,600 feet, and what followed, well, it was pretty much a perfect jump. A few seconds of free fall, a parachute deploying exactly right, and then a soft landing in the meadow. Absolutely ideal. Frank, he nailed it. He then took a moment to kind of soak in what he had just accomplished, but he quickly realized that he was not alone. Now, you can probably understand why base jumping isn't just frowned upon by most authority figures, but that it's actually illegal in a lot of places, including national parks, and it's been that way for a long time. And yet, despite that, you can probably also imagine how hard it is to actually enforce this. I mean, base jumpers would strategically plan their stunts under the cover of darkness and even have elaborate plans with like getaway cars, all in an effort to evade park rangers. However, on this particular day, someone had tipped off the park rangers about Frank's jump, and instead of them trying to stop him, they actually decided to try and make an example out of him after the fact. And so before Frank could even pack up his parachute, 2 park rangers began bounding towards him, coming out of the bush, basically from nowhere. In 1999, getting caught base jumping in a national park would be chalked up to a federal misdemeanor, carrying a very hefty fine as well as mandatory gear confiscation. And that would have been devastating for Frank. And let's just say that he wasn't going to be an easy takedown for these particular rangers. A game of cat and mouse was about to commence, and no one knew it at the time, but this game was about to have consequences so severe that it still haunts the park to this day. Now, I'll never go base jumping, but I do like to hike, despite the name of this channel. And when I hike, I get so sweaty, it's ridiculous. It's honestly a miracle I haven't ended up in one of my own videos yet. And probably the only reason that hasn't happened is because I drink Element electrolytes every single time I'm on the trail. Element is the sponsor of this video, and I don't just drink them on the trail, actually. I drink them pretty much anytime I'm sweating at all, whether that's at the gym or playing pickleball or doing yard work. I don't do yard work. I know you've seen ads on YouTube for other electrolyte companies out there, and the thing is, Element is so much better than them. I'm just gonna say it. Element has no sugar, which is huge. I mean, pretty much all the other ones I feel like just are loaded up with sugar and other crap. Like, why are you putting that stuff in your body? All Element has is the electrolytes that you need to stay safe and hydrated, as well as a great taste. They got citrus salt, they got lemonade salt, grapefruit salt, so many other amazing flavors. I guarantee they have something for your palate. What you need to do is go to drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking. That's drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking, or click the link at the top of the description. Go purchase whatever sounds best to you, and when you do it through my link, you are going to get a sample pack of 8 additional Element flavors thrown in with your order for no extra cost. You're gonna get some extra sticks, and you're just gonna get to sample all of Element's most popular flavors. And so, one more time, drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking and go get yourself some free Element. And now, buckle up, because this story is about to get insane. I don't know how else to say it. Like, you'll see. Now, by the time Frank took this fateful jump and then started running from the park rangers, he had already acquired a bitter distrust of them from a previous bad experience. You see, in 1998, the year before this particular jump, Frank had lost one of his good base jumping friends, Dan Osman, to a fall while he had been anchored to a rope. Or should I say, fall. Basically, what really happened was that Dan's rope, which he had left out overnight on a spire in Yosemite called the Leaning Tower, well, that rope had somehow weakened. And while the story goes that weather or friction caused Dan's rope to break, there were also theories of foul play. There was chatter that maybe a park ranger came by and then messed with the anchor system, tired of daredevils like Dan and Frank mocking the rules of the park. And so with this distrust in the back of his mind, as well as the panic of losing his gear at the front of it, Frank ran away from the rangers, sprinting towards the Merced River that cuts through Yosemite. His new plan, which he seemed to be coming up with on the fly, was to jump into the river, try crossing it, and then disappear into the wilderness before the rangers could catch him. But for all of Frank's careful calculations, he missed one very small but very important detail. June was runoff season, and the Merced River was pumping with snowmelt moving fast enough to knock down a grown bear, let alone a human being. And so before Frank could even feel the shock of the cold in the water, the current grabbed him and then pulled him down hard into what divers call a washing machine. In a flash, Frank was rushed away with the river. A search and rescue team later found Frank on July 7th, almost a month later. His body was covered in algae. He was stripped of all of his base jumping gear, and of course, he was lifeless. The official cause of death, as reported by the park rangers, was accidental drowning resulting from fleeing an illegal parachute jump. But the base jumping community, well, they saw a very different story. Frank had survived the jump, which they felt was the actual dangerous part, right? And then Frank had died because of the threat of arrest, forcing him into fleeing. And so to them, essentially a murder had occurred. Within just days, calls for protest began spreading throughout the base jumping community. Frank's mother was absolutely devastated. Frank's friends were outraged, and the Yosemite base jumping community decided that enough was enough. Enough hiding, enough running, enough watching friends die fleeing rangers instead of facing actual jump hazards. They were going to make a statement and prove that base jumping could be done safely, and a 60-year-old woman from Santa Barbara stepped forward to help make this happen. Her name was Jan Davis, and if you designed the perfect base jumping ambassador, you would create her, not a 20-something adrenaline junkie or an influencer chasing viral videos, but a 60-year-old grandmother with 16 years of jumping experience, 3,000 plus skydives, and about 50 to 70 base jumps under her belt. Jan was the first woman to ever jump Angel Falls in Venezuela, which means that she leaped off of a 3,212-foot waterfall, which is higher than El Capitan, jumping into mist and rainbows with a very long fall before eventually deploying her parachute over the rainforest canopy. But one thing that's important to understand is that Jan wasn't just a base jumper or a skydiver, she was a master rigger, which means that she was certified to pack other people's parachutes, and she literally packed parachutes for James Bond movies. You see, when stunt coordinators needed someone who understood freefall physics, canopy deployment mechanisms, and folding patterns that meant the difference between life and death, they called Jan Davis. She worked on Drop Zone and Terminal Velocity in multiple Bond films, and she didn't just coordinate, she executed, jumping alongside performers and showing them how it was done. In base jumping's small world, Jan was royalty. She was even referred to as the queen of base jumping. She wasn't just playing around with this, it was her life, her passion, her profession even, and of course it was her identity. However, she wasn't born into it either. Jan had lived an entire previous life married to a Santa Barbara police chief, raising a family and living the conventional, respectable life that you'd expect from a police chief's wife in an upper-class beach town. But then, sometime in her mid to late 40s, after that chapter ended, Jan Davis reinvented herself completely through skydiving, base jumping, and stunt work, transforming from someone's housewife into the queen of the Earth's most dangerous sports. And that kind of transformation does not happen casually. You don't accidentally become a master rigger or whimsically become the first woman to jump off the legendary Angel Falls. Jan Davis had something to prove, maybe to herself, maybe to the world, I don't know which one, but she had spent her last 15 years doing just that over and over with a determination that was impossible to ignore. And that same energy also led Jan to meet a partner who was willing to go to the edge alongside her. His name was Tom Sanders. 46-year-old Tom Sanders had been base jumping since 1978. Now, he was 14 years younger than Jan, but to them, age clearly was just a number. Tom was also a stunt filmmaker documenting humanity's most dangerous activities like skydiving and base jumping and high-altitude mountaineering, wingsuit flying, you name it. Basically, if it involved defying gravity, then well, Tom would be there with his camera. In 1988, he started a company called Aerial Focus, which was a Santa Barbara-based cinematography company that supplied photographers and technical support for films, commercials, and documentaries. And somewhere around that same year, Tom met Jan, who was already an experienced skydiver with a deep understanding of the sport's technical side. Tom was surely captivated by Jan's ability to pack a chute. That sounded way dirtier than I thought it would. However you want to put it, Tom Sanders fell rapidly in love with Jan, and together, they built a business that emphasized both the safety and the thrill of base jumping. They became partners both romantically and professionally, with Jan working alongside Tom on productions as a technical advisor and safety coordinator. When Tom needed complex aerial maneuvers demonstrated, Jan strapped on the gear and showed the stunt performers how it was done. And when Jan needed her jumps documented, like Angel Falls, all these impossible cliffs, well, Tom was there to film it. And what made their relationship powerful was that they understood each other's risk tolerance completely. Tom knew which jumps made Jan nervous and which ones didn't, and Jan knew which shots Tom needed and exactly how to deliver them. They'd done this dance hundreds of times across years of working together, which makes what happened on October 22nd, 1999, particularly cruel. You see, Tom wasn't worried about Jan jumping El Capitan. Tom even said, quote, "This is a very, very forgiving base jump." And while hindsight is 2020, he was right. By base standards, El Capitan is one of the safest jumps possible. High enough for plenty of deployment time, overhung enough that, you fall away from the rock, with a massive open meadow as a landing zone and no technical complications or tricky winds. El Capitan is the jump you do when you want to feel the rush without any serious danger. It's base jumping's bunny slope, essentially, an easy scenic drive. And so Tom set up his camera that day, expecting to document Jan's jump, as well as a successful protest. You see, the park rangers were allowing the base jump to happen peacefully and freely, and then one at a time, once the jumpers landed from their jump, they would be arrested and their gear would be confiscated. That was the plan. They had essentially brokered this deal between the park rangers and the jumpers. The rangers would let them go up, they would let them jump even though it was illegal, and then the base jumpers would essentially let the rangers arrest them at the bottom. Now, it's important to note that all of the jumpers would be using either borrowed gear or cheap backup equipment, stuff they could afford to lose because, once again, when they landed on the ground, their gear was going to be confiscated by the rangers. I mean, why lose your best expensive equipment when you could just use someone else's cast-off rig? It made perfect sense, and all 5 jumpers made the same calculation. Keep your real gear, don't use it, and then sacrifice someone else's cheaper gear. After they got arrested, the plan would be for all 5 base jumpers to have their day in court. They would fight the criminal charges against them and hope to create a safe, regulated system for future base jumps. And I do have to say, it's just kind of unbelievable to me that after all of the intense efforts that the Park Service made to stop base jumps from happening, literally chasing down base jumpers on foot, that they would then go and double back and let this peaceful protest play out. I mean, it was essentially sanctioned by them. It's just very strange, and maybe the strangeness around this whole plan is actually a little bit of foreshadowing to the truly insane sequence of events that would follow. The night before the protest, Jan called her friend Frank Zinn to invite him along. Tom and Jan were heading to Yosemite and they wanted Frank there to photograph the protest. However, Frank was house sitting and said that he couldn't come because, well, he had a cat to feed. And in response, Jan said, well, double feed the cat, in a playful voice. And so with that, Frank double fed the cat, and the next morning at 8:15, he joined Tom Sanders and the crowd gathering beneath El Capitan. A photographer from the Associated Press, Paul Sakuma, snapped photographs of the scene. Park Ranger Mary Littell Hinson instructed her team on the protocol for seizing gear and arresting the jumpers. And of course, also there in the crowd alongside the reporters, the park rangers, the base enthusiasts, and onlookers was a grieving mother. She had just buried her son Frank a few months earlier, and now she was present for the protest that these base jumpers had organized in honor of her son. That morning, the 5 jumpers summited together, accompanied by park rangers who were monitoring the protest, which actually allowed them to speed up the mountain much quicker than usual. By all accounts, everyone was excited. Well, except for maybe the park rangers, but even they apparently were feeling the momentum of everything that was going on. I mean, maybe base jumping was actually safer than the media was making it out to be. Maybe this protest would actually work. Everyone was playing their assigned roles, and everything was in place for it to operate smoothly. Or almost everything. I'll get to that in a second. The jumps were scheduled for 2 p.m., and as the hour approached, the tension among everyone continued to build. It was now abundantly clear that this wasn't just a protest anymore. It was a spectacle being broadcast through all those cameras down below, and all of the notepads pointed skyward. And so at exactly 2 p.m., the first jumper stepped to El Capitan's edge and launched into the void. After about 16 seconds, a parachute deployed perfectly and bloomed against the granite face of El Capitan, spiraling down with a soft landing. Ranger Mary's team then clicked handcuffs around the jumper as the camera snapped and led them away. The crowd applauded, and then the second jumper followed with a perfect exit, a textbook deployment, and a soft landing that drew even more applause and cheers. Everything was going according to plan for both the jumpers and the Rangers. The third jumper then executed flawlessly, and the atmosphere became almost festive, with people relaxing and chatting and enjoying the beautiful October weather, because by this point, the jumpers, they had pretty much proven their point. This sport was much safer than it looks, and all the Park Service had to do was stop treating them like criminals. And speaking of that, Jan took the criminal theme quite literally that day. She showed up wearing a black and white striped jumpsuit, dressed like an old school prisoner so that she could make her point loud and clear. She would be the fourth jumper, and there was little fanfare as she stepped to the edge. Frankly, it was a little bit too calm. Tom Sanders positioned himself with his camera down below, ready to capture his girlfriend's historic contribution to this historic moment. AP photographer Paul Sakuma pulled his lens skyward. Ranger Mary prepared her handcuffs. Jan took a deep breath. She leaned into the wind around her, recognizing the familiar weight of the parachute that was on her back. This all felt normal. It felt safe. And so, after a countdown, Jan jumped from the ledge of El Capitan with a clean exit, no tumbling, no awkward positioning, no problems at all. Tom watched through the viewfinder of his camera. The crowd down below oohed and awed, but Ranger Mary, who was standing over a half-mile below, she felt something clench in her stomach. Years around parachutes and base jumpers had caused her to develop an instinct for what a good deployment looks like, for the timing between exit and parachute canopy, and something about how Jan was falling, about the slight delay, well, it made Mary's alarm bells start ringing. 5 seconds passed with Jan falling down from El Capitan's peak. Her black and white stripes stood out starkly against the gray granite. The wind whipped through her costume, making a sound kind of like thumbing rapidly through a deck of cards, if you know what I mean. 8 seconds passed with still no parachute. Jan was cutting it a little bit close, but she still had plenty of time. And by that, I mean about 5 or so more seconds. But still, in base jumping, that's more than enough time to deploy a parachute. As she had done thousands of times before, Jan's right hand moved to the back of her pack. She was reaching for where the handle of her chute should be, where it always was, where 15 years of doing this had trained her to find it without thinking. But this time, for the first time in her life, the handle wasn't there. She reached her left hand back and then both hands, but still there was no handle. Now, once again, if you'll recall, Jan had borrowed someone else's gear. Not wanting to get her stuff confiscated by the park rangers, she had kind of taken a shortcut, and there was now a massive problem. The rig that Jan was wearing didn't have a bottom of container style chute where the handle was at the small of her back. Instead, the handle for this particular parachute was on her thigh, and apparently Jan had no clue. Around 10 seconds passed as Jan fell further and further down. The crowd's cheers of "Go, baby, go!" and excitement turned into confused shouts of "Open, open, open." People in the crowd, even those who knew nothing about base jumping, were now starting to realize that something was wrong, and their voices were getting tense and rising. Tom Sanders watched Jan through his viewfinder. He watched as his girlfriend picked up speed, thinking she'll deploy that parachute any second. I mean, she's just waiting for the right altitude. She knows what she's doing. She's Jan after all. But as Tom tracked Jan further down the face of El Capitan, he eventually saw something that he wished he hadn't. It was the tree line. It came into frame at the bottom of his shot, and when this happened, he knew what was coming next. At this point, Jan had given up on the parachute. She actually put her arms to her side, trying to keep what's called a boxman position, which is what you want to do if you're free falling to limit tumbling and slow your speed as much as you can, but this was all happening way too late. Just about 18 seconds after she had jumped, Jan abandoned that pose and she put her hands over her face because she was starting to see something far more horrifying than trees. She was seeing the ground. And so, 19 seconds after she first jumped, Jan hit the boulders traveling at 120 miles per hour. At this point, she was out of view of everyone. She was too low, and so no one saw it, but everyone heard it. The sound was described by witnesses as almost like slapping a deck of cards against a table, except much louder. A horrible impact that echoed across the entire meadow and was followed by absolute silence. Absolute silence. As 150 people began to process what they had all just witnessed together. Eventually, someone screamed. A car alarm went off. A child in the crowd started to cry. Tom Sanders slumped forward onto his camera with his hands gripping the equipment sides, and both Frank Zinn as well as Ricarda Gambili ran over to comfort him. It was just a brutal scene. I mean, I can only imagine. Ranger Mary had spent years performing Yosemite's most dangerous rescues, dangling on ropes beside giant cliff faces during helicopter operations, while heavy winds threatened to slam her into rock, technical recoveries where one wrong move meant joining whoever she was trying to save in death. She knew what humans looked like when gravity won, but she'd never watched someone die in real time from only 150 yards away while knowing that there was absolutely nothing she could do. She recounted that she had never heard a sound quite like Jan falling so fast, so violently through the air, and then that sound of her hitting the ground, an impact that didn't just mean instant death, but something far messier. Ranger Mary, who'd recovered dozens of bodies in her career, put on rubber gloves and walked over to where Jan Davis's body lay on the rocks. I mean, just imagine watching someone die, knowing that you couldn't help them, the sound of that impact, the silence afterwards, the awful scene you had to go inspect, looking like it's straight out of a horror film. Honestly, I wonder if she even felt like a tinge of guilt as the handcuffs that she had planned to place on Jan Davis dangled on her belt. And not that she should have felt any guilt. Obviously, I'm not suggesting it's her fault, but I don't know, man. It's just so sad for everyone involved. Tom Sanders gave one quote to reporters on October 22nd before disappearing into his grief that day. He said, quote, "If only she had used her own gear." He repeated this what if over and over to the friends who tried to help him, fixating on that single decision, that practical choice, that financial calculation that Jan had made, the calculation that ended up costing her her life. And you might think that a death like this would end the debate about base jumping on the spot, but it didn't. It actually made the fighting over base jumps in Yosemite even nastier, and folks, the deaths didn't stop there either. In the immediate aftermath of Jan's death, Park Service officials and base jumping advocates went to war with each other once again. Park officials reaffirmed the ban, citing what had played out on October 22nd as proof that the sport is in fact too dangerous. And on the other hand, base jumpers countered that danger wasn't the point, freedom was. And they also said that Jan had died because they were forced to once again operate in the shadows using unfamiliar equipment. Tom Sanders scattered Jan's ashes near Lake Elsinore at a skydiving ceremony, surrounded by friends who jumped with her and understood why she did what she did, even as they mourned her loss. And then life moved on in the way that it always does. Jan became a story that base jumpers told each other, a cautionary tale about borrowed equipment and muscle memory. Yosemite's base jumping ban obviously remained in place, and if anything, Jan's death hardened the positions on both sides. For the base jumping community, she became something like a martyr. And here's the thing about martyrs, well, they don't end movements, they fuel them. Jan Davis's death didn't stop base jumping in Yosemite. It intensified everything. more and more base jumpers came to the park, sneaking up trails in the darkness, launching at dawn, and pushing boundaries precisely because the park said that they couldn't. And the park rangers would try everything they could to stop them, threatening arrests and gear confiscation, and even permanent bans from national parks. Over the years, people kept jumping from El Capitan illegally, kept getting arrested, kept getting their gear confiscated, but surprisingly, no one died base jumping in the park for almost 2 decades. The community seemed to have learned something from Jan's death. Use your own gear, know your equipment, respect the jump, all that stuff. However, all of this would change once again because on May 16th, 2015, these 2 men threw a giant wrench into any part of this story being over. They were Dean Potter and Graham Hunt. Just after sunset on this late spring day, Dean Potter and Graham Hunt hiked to Taft Point, which is a 7,500 foot prominence on Yosemite's south rim, and they did this to attempt a wingsuit flight, which is different than base jumping, but in terms of the thrill and the danger and stuff, at least to those of us that don't do it, it seems pretty similar. They were going to weave themselves between rock formations before eventually deploying their parachutes, which sounds insane to me, but it's important to note that Dean Potter and Graham Hunt were basically legends in the world of extreme sports. Dean, a 43-year-old, he had walked lines between Yosemite's peaks. He had base jumped over 3,000 times and flew in wingsuits across giant valleys and gorges. And Graham, who was 31 years old, he was Dean's wingsuit partner, and just 3 days earlier, he had carved his way through Taft Point already on a successful flight. A flight that went undetected by rangers, by the way. Dean and Graham were also known for being 2 of the safest in the sport, and by 2015, base jumping had changed a lot. Since Jan's jump in 1999, more fail-safes had been discovered by the community, and there were more evolutions to equipment that reduced the chances of severe injury or death. There's actually a TV series on HBO Max right now that tells Dean Potter's story and captures this moment in base jumping history. But to bring you back to Yosemite, at 7:30 p.m., as the last light of the day drained from the sky, Dean and Graham stood over the south rim of the park. For a moment, they processed their flight plan for one final time. And then they jumped together. For the first few seconds, everything was perfect. They were 2 silhouettes flying against the fading daylight. But that perfection would only last for a few seconds, because moments later, with no one around to see or hear what happened, both Dean Potter and Graham Hunt hit a ridgeline at high speed. Neither of them deployed their parachutes. The next morning, their bodies were found, and they became the 7th and 8th people to die base jumping in Yosemite since 1980, joining Dan Osman, Frank Gambale III, and of course, Jan Davis. The base jumping community was once again devastated. Dean Potter especially was considered one of the sport's safest leaders, someone who calculated risks obsessively. And so if Dean could die, then pretty much anyone could. Park Service officials gave the same statement essentially they'd given after Jan's death and after Frank's death, after Dan Osman's death, after pretty much every death. And the base jumping community gave the same exact counter argument. And here's what makes the base jumping debate so impossible to resolve. Both sides actually have some pretty valid points, and there's no clear answer that's going to satisfy everyone. Now, obviously, base jumping is extraordinarily dangerous. 573-ish deaths worldwide since 1981, a fatality rate of 1 death per 2,317 jumps. And just for context, that makes it 43 times more dangerous than skydiving, right? And we know that number because the base jumping community is actually keeping track. On the website baseaddict.com, they have what's called the base fatality list, where every person who has died is not only honored, but their cause of death is also recorded. And I think this is notable because it illustrates that the base jumping community obviously doesn't want more death. They want to prevent it. They want to make this very dangerous thing as safe as it possibly can be. However, once again, if you're base jumping, you're voluntarily doing something that might kill you. And to me, the Park Service essentially saying, we won't facilitate this risky thing on our public land. Well, that's not exactly unreasonable either. But I do have to tell you that there actually was a time when Yosemite allowed base jumping. In 1980, the Park Service instituted a trial period for base jumping. You know, they had to go get a permit, but as long as they did that, it was allowed. And for a little while, it worked. Jumpers went and got their permits, they jumped safely, and everyone was happy. But then apparently jumpers started violating rules because, you know, they're kind of rebellious. And on the last day of the trial period, a group of 10 base jumpers did something absolutely devious. They actually drove a pickup truck as far up the mountain as they possibly could. And when they couldn't drive it anymore, they hiked the rest of the way to the summit. And from there, these 10 jumpers started launching themselves off of El Capitan in the most creative ways possible. And folks, this was like a scene out of a summer camp movie. I'm talking pogo sticks and skateboards, jumpers dressed in hilarious costumes. And I can even imagine there may have been a few beers involved, but who's to say? Later on, this whole thing became known as the Flatbed 10 incident, and it embarrassed the hell out of the Park Service. It embarrassed them so badly that they reinstated the ban on base jumping and vowed to never allow it in the park again. And the little moments like this Flatbed 10 incident were followed by even more moments of like true tragedy, like Dan Osmond's ropes, that whole scenario, Frank's chase down and death, Jan Davis's equipment swap out, and then Dean Potter's nighttime flight. It just created a culture of mistrust between the base jumpers and the park rangers. And so to me, it kind of seems like a classic case of finger pointing, where both sides have contributed to an impossible situation with no good resolution. And this is especially tragic because the names of these base jumpers who died became tied into this whole controversial story, the one I'm telling you right now, instead of simply being remembered for the people that they actually were. Jan Davis jumped off of El Capitan on October 22nd, 1999, in order to make a statement. She wanted to prove that base jumping could be done safely and that jumpers deserved the right to pursue their sports in America's national parks. But ultimately, her jump proved pretty much the exact opposite. It demonstrated that even a 60-year-old master rigger with 70 previous base jumps could still die on one of the sport's easier cliffs, all because of one single oversight. It gave the Park Service their strongest argument against ever reconsidering the ban. It made Jan a cautionary tale about borrowed equipment, about protests, about the price of standing up for what you believe in. I mean, she became a story that base jumpers tell each other, a reminder that skill and experience don't guarantee survival, and that even the easiest jumps can still kill you if one small thing goes wrong. But here's the thing, folks. Jan Davis believed base jumping was worth dying for. She knew the risks. She calculated them precisely with the same analytical mind that made her a master rigger in the first place. And after all that, she still chose to jump anyway. And Tom Sanders, I mean, he stood there with his camera knowing what Jan was doing was incredibly dangerous, and he still filmed it anyways. Ricarda Gamboli stood in that meadow months after burying her son and watched other people jump the same cliff that started his death, essentially. Anyways, they all believed in something enough to accept the consequences. And honestly, who am I to say that they were wrong? And who am I to say that the Park Service is wrong either for trying to prevent those consequences? It's really an impossible question with no satisfying answer, which is why the debate continues to this day, why jumpers keep jumping, and why rangers keep arresting them, why the ban endures, why it all just repeats and repeats. I'd love to hear your take in the comments on this one because the debate rages on. Please just be sure to be respectful to all of the victims I covered. Be respectful to the park rangers. Remember, these are real people with real loved ones. And I've also linked the book Ranger Confidential by Andrea Langford down below, which was absolutely invaluable when researching this story. I mean, we wouldn't have even known about it without that book. And so I highly recommend you read that, especially if you like my videos. I promise you're gonna love that book. And if this was your first time watching me, I really hope I earned your subscription. I appreciate you watching regardless. And if you liked this video, be sure to stick around for this one right here that YouTube seems to think you'll enjoy next.